We are now live.
We are now live. Good afternoon, everybody. I am super happy to be talking with Dr. Nate Bogert today. He's professor of saxophone at Ball State University since 2014. Friend of mine since long before that. Winner of the NASA competition, MTNA competition, Fish-Off, gold medalist at Fish-Off.
Silver medalist.
Silver medalist, all right. Just a wonderful musician and really dynamic teacher. So I'm thrilled to have Dr. Bogert with us today.
Thanks, man. Really good to be here. And thank you for doing this. This has been really fun to watch all the different perspectives and share. So anything I can add, I'm happy to.
Yeah, well, one of the things that that I've always asked is, I give that little brief intro just kind of with some highlights, but tell us about your background. One of the reasons why I got to know you a long time ago was actually me teaching in Kentucky. Mm-hmm. And so tell us about your background, where you're from,
sure.
And all that stuff.
I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, and I went to the performing arts school there in Louisville for high school, and that's how I even knew who you were, was because my teacher, Ron Jones, was familiar with all the guys teaching universities in Kentucky, and you had just come to Moorhead. I mean, gosh, I think you were what, 24 when you started? I mean, you were young.
I was 25 when I started.
Yeah, 25. And I remember him telling me about, there's this young guy at Moorhead. Seems like he's pretty good. He was, but I went to high school in Louisville. I grew up there, and then I did my undergraduate degree at Ball State with George Wolfe. And then after that, I ended up going out to the University of Iowa to study with Kenneth Che. I did my master's in jazz studies out there, and then I ended up staying to do my doctorate with Dr. Che. It was one of those situations where I didn't necessarily have that intention of staying at Iowa when I started. And I think you and I have talked about this, that I thought, I'm going to do 3 different degrees at 3 places. And that was something I felt strongly about. And then I tell you, just within the first year of studying with Dr. Che, I thought, man, I could study with this guy for 20 years and I would still have stuff to learn, So it just seemed like the right thing to do. And there were some other factors that kept me there as well, but it just worked out that I was able to stay at Iowa, and I finished my DMA out there in 2013. Mm-hmm. Yeah, 2013. And then I really finished the coursework for my DMA in early 2012. And I had been working, actually I was a chef, and I was working in some restaurants and then managing some restaurants for like 2.5 years. And then the job at Ball State came open when Dr. Wolfe retired. And I started here in a 1-year position as visiting, and then was fortunate enough to get the tenure track position in 15. So I just finished my 5th year in the tenure track job, but my 6th year overall at Ball State.
Yeah. So, well, since you mentioned being a chef, we'll take a detour into that for a little bit. One of my big passions really also is cooking. I'd be interested to know, do you see any correlation between being a chef and being a musician?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some really obvious connections you can make. I mean, number one is just simply how much work is involved. I mean, when I was working in restaurants, I was there, especially when you're leading a kitchen or just a restaurant overall, you show up at 7:00 in the morning, taking orders and doing inventory and scheduling and taxes, all the above. And so just the work load that you have and the multitasking and all that you have to do is really, similar to what we do as musicians, that we balance our schedules, teaching, performing, practicing, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
So, I mean, the workload, I would say, and then, if I wanted to be more idealistic about it, I guess I could talk about, the creativity aspect of it, especially when I was actually working in kitchens mostly. I was fortunate enough, I was working in some restaurants where, I was able to write the menus and create specials on a weekly or daily basis sometimes, and got to work with, small organic farms and stuff like that. So just having to kind of take what you're given, or having, just kind of using your imagination to grab at different ingredients or different concepts and stuff like that, on the fly, and to put them together into something cohesive. There's definitely some overlap there with music that, you like to think that a lot of what we do is in the moment, and new things happen every time, even if you're playing the same piece, that new things happen with every subsequent performance. So, I think just sort of that being in the moment, that kind of thing,
yeah,
very similar in that way.
Yeah, well, so the reason why I asked that is I was thinking about this the other day as I was cooking, and there are also like some other pragmatic things that just like there are fundamentals and
oh yeah,
too, right? Anyway, we don't have to get off on that. I just like the kind of the corollaries that we can explore. But so you mentioned Ron Jones.
Yep.
How long did you study with Ron?
Geez, I think 5 years. I started with Mr. Jones in the last year of, maybe like midway through my last year of middle school. And man, it was so fortunate that he was my teacher, because I'll never forget. It was a big deal for me to start taking lessons, because my oldest sister took lessons, and so financially it wasn't easy. I don't want to overstate any kind of financial duress or anything, but it just, it was an expense that if I wasn't going to take it seriously, then it was not just something that my parents had money to just kind of throw away to send me somewhere for a half hour a week kind of thing.
Right.
And I'll never forget, within the first month of taking lessons with Mr. Jones, that we got done with the lesson, and he pulls my mom in the office and he says, "I don't want to teach him anymore." And I'm just sitting there like, wow, and I knew that it had not been a good lesson, I couldn't believe it, and he says, "Yeah, I don't want to teach him anymore." And she says, "Well, what seems to be the problem?" And he said, "Well, he's not practicing, he's not taking it seriously. He's not practicing. And I know that this isn't, the easiest thing financially, and I don't want to waste your time and waste your money. And I'm just, I'm not going to do that." And I remember my mom just saying something to the effect of like, "Oh, we'll talk when we get home," which meant, I was in big trouble.
Right.
And so needless to say, we didn't have any of those run-ins after that. But from the get-go, he just, he really, in a very healthy way, was very stern in a lot of ways, and just, he took it seriously, and he really impressed upon all of his students that, if you're not going to take it seriously, then why do it? Because there's so many other things you could spend your life doing that are, you make a lot more money and you work a lot less.
Yeah. Well, so from an early age, then that was impressed upon you, like the work ethic of it.
Oh yeah. And in fact, I remember, the first thing we did was major scales and the chromatic scale with the chromatic fingerings. Right. And I remember, and I say this to my students, it's like an echo of him. And I remember him telling me, he would say, this can be as painful or as painless as you want it to be, because if you just go home and do it, then we can go on to all the other fun stuff that you want to study or you want to work on. But if you don't, then we're not going to move on until, and he didn't mean like, you have to play it at 160 beats a minute perfectly, but he meant, if I can't tell that you're putting in work on these scales and arpeggios and articulation patterns, the really fundamental stuff, if I can't tell that you're putting in the time on that stuff, then we're not going to do anything other than that until you commit to it. And that just ended up being huge. I didn't know it at the time, but when the more and more I work with younger students, and the more of them I see who haven't been fortunate enough to have a teacher who was that sort of direct about fundamentals, the more and more thankful I am about having that experience as my first sort of applied study of saxophone with him. Yeah.
Now, what books did he use with you? I mean, and there are a lot of folks on here who probably teach a lot of younger students. I mean, I used to love teaching. Actually, I loved teaching middle school students.
Sure.
Like, you could get them so excited about music. So really, what was he working on with you book wise?
Yeah. Well, we, in the beginning, we worked a lot out of the DeVille, the Universal Method.
Right.
Which I think there's still a lot of stuff that we can take out of the DeVille. And I think the DeVille has kind of been stolen from, or borrowed from, I should say. I don't mean maliciously stolen from, but borrowed from in a lot of ways, and just sort of updated and refined in a lot of method books that are out now. But the great thing about the DeVille when you're working with young students is that it's kind of a one-stop shop for a lot of different stuff, So if you have kids, especially who don't have a lot of money to buy a lot of materials and all that kind of thing, the DeVille kind of, especially in the early stages of playing, it definitely has a lot in there. It goes through patterns and scales and articulation patterns. And, I think there's 100 pages out front that are just, it talks about making reeds and the stuff that dates it to, I think, 1903 or 1908 when it was published.
Okay.
But yeah, so we worked a lot out of DeVille. And then when we moved on, we never really moved on from it, I don't want to say, because it's, 5 million pages. But we worked a lot out of Fairling in the beginning. And that just seemed to make sense because at that time, the Kentucky All-State stuff, it was all, they would just take from Fairling. If you probably remember that it would be like a Fairling etude and an excerpt from some, hallmark piece of ours, something from the canon. So we worked out of Fairling a lot, and trying to think if there was anything else that he really, I think that was probably it, and the other thing I would say is from the beginning, he worked on full range scales with us, like we played our scales full range from the get-go, which was not something in the DeVille, but something that he was like, this is how we do this, from the very beginning.
And was he, I mean, I'm curious in asking this because you're talking about the expectations that he's setting early on. Was he also on you about hand position, not just like working on the scale, but working on your approach to it?
Oh man, yeah, everything. I mean, that's one of the things about that experience, again, that I didn't know it while I was going through it, but now that I look back and I find myself going to those same things over and over with my students, it's like, boy, how fortunate was I that was my first teacher, because it was, it was embouchure, it was not moving the embouchure, it was, always, one thing I remember him always talking about would be, no matter what you're doing, you're trying to make the best sound you can make at all times, in all registers, with all the articulation. It was always about, does it sound good? So it wasn't just, okay, we're going to play these scales because this helps our technique. It was this sort of foundational, holistic approach to developing as a saxophone player, because I remember him telling me very early on that he would always say, look, if you can just play the horn, you can go do whatever you want with it. You can play, because I came in, and the interesting thing about Mr. Jones is that he has a bachelor's degree in music education, but he's a very fine and accomplished jazz saxophonist.
Right.
I mean, that's mainly what you're going to hear him do when you hear him at a gig. He plays jazz.
Yeah.
But man, he just has figured out how to teach people he just has figured out a way to teach young people how to play saxophone in this really beautiful way. So I went into it thinking like, oh, cool, I can study jazz with him and da-da-da. And he would always say, yeah, when we get there, yeah, absolutely. But he would always make the point to say, first, you got to learn how to play the horn.
Yeah.
And once you get that, then once you understand how to play the instrument just from a fundamental level, you can really, it's yours. You can manipulate it to do whatever you want. And that just continues to serve me to this day to play jazz, to play Latin music, to play classical, whatever you want to call it, concert saxophone, and so on and so forth. So that was one of the sort of hallmarks of how he would teach teach us was that just, I want you to be a good saxophone player. So it was really everything, you know, hand position, and I mean, we got all of that from the jump, you know.
So who, I mean, you know, for those out there who don't know him, who are some of his other students?
Ryan Muncie studied with Ron. I did. There was a guy at Ball State, actually, when I started here. His name was Paul Davis, and he was a prize winner at NASA before I got there. Pat Mosser, who's down in Nashville now, doing really well. And there's just a bunch of guys. Ben Kessler down in Texas studied with Ron. I mean, there's just a bunch of guys all over the place who are band directors, and the thing that's scary is they're all really good saxophone. You know, I mean, they're just good. And he just continues cranking them out. You know, I mean, there's a lot of them. I think several of his students are studying with Adam now at U of L, Adam McCord. And so that's really great that Adam's there in Louisville and doing such a great job with that studio, because it makes it really, it just makes a really beautiful symbiotic kind of thing happening there between a great studio there in Louisville and a really fine school of music. So
right.
I've been really happy to see that too.
So from high school, you go on to Ball State and you study with George.
Yep.
So tell us a little bit about what it was like studying with George Wolfe. Like, what were your takeaways from studying with him?
Man, that could be a whole, you know, that could be a long conversation. But the biggest things I would say that I took away from George were really just, number one, the biggest thing that I continue to respect about George and always will, and something that he impressed upon me from really early on, and that I didn't really get it until I was 2 or 3 years in. But, you know, George was always just so unapologetic about what he chose to play, you know, and he played it because he was passionate about it, you know, and there's obviously, I mean, George, for anybody who is, you know, intimately familiar with his playing, George has played at a very virtuosic level, you know, when he was in his prime and practicing all the time. I mean, he was as good as there was, I think, in a lot of ways. But you wouldn't know that if you heard him at the average recital that he gave, because he played a lot of very interesting, he was very kind of, you know, out there music. He did a lot of motivic improvisation. He was really big into Rio Nota's music, very big into Carnatic music. He was just such an eclectic musician. And so sometimes there would be frustration from some of us students, like, man, I just want to hear him play Desenclo, or I just want to hear him play Creston. And he would always kind of, you know, now that I've become as close to him as I am now, given that he still lives in Muncie, it's very clear that he's just like, you know, okay, I already played that 10 times. You know, I want to play something else. And so something else that I'm really passionate about. So programming was something that I really took from him, that, you know, there needs to be context for the pieces that you program, you know, and you don't want to overload a program in any one way. You don't want to overload it with difficulty. You don't want to overload it with, you know, aesthetic, you know, it just, you want balance in your programming. But then more sort of idealistically, the idea that whatever you program, you should be playing it because you're really passionate about that music, because you're going to be, anything that you do that you're not, it's very clear to the people who know, who are, the informed listener can catch on pretty quickly to a disingenuous performance of anything, right? I mean, so that was one thing he was really big on, was just, you know, whatever it is that you're playing, you want to make sure that it's something that you really have an emotional investment into, so that, you know, that, because that's going to be something that comes across to your audience very clearly.
Right.
So that was one thing, one of the really big things. The other big thing was just sound, you know. I mean, George, his sound is just, he just has this really unique, beautiful sound. And I spent a lot of time modeling after him and Eugene Rousseau, and you know, Dr. Wolfe would often talk about the Larry Teal and how he had taken a lot of ideas from Donald Cinta as far as sound goes. I'll never forget, he had a signed picture of Larry Teal that hung in his office all the time, you know. And so just having those really early role models that were such, you know, icons of sound, saxophone sound, was just massive for me. And then ultimately really shaped who I chose to study with, and the people that I've continued to be inspired by and modeled after. Was that, you know, I mean, sound is, you know, the first thing I'm kind of listening for is, if we're talking about just purely saxophone playing, you know.
Right.
So sound with George, and vibrato, and using how to you know, the sort of the intention of vibrato, and how to use that and why, and it, you know, not having it be an on and off switch kind of deal. And that was probably the other really big thing that I took from George. And just really, I guess I would say the third thing would be the innate sort of figuring out that way to convey whatever innate musicianship you have, you know, and that ties into the programming part of it. You know, you want to pick things that most easily kind of help you to convey your artistic voice to the audience. And that was another really huge part of what I learned from George was how to do that, you know, and how to, and not to say that you should only pick stuff that you think you're going to sound good playing, you know, but how to take something that maybe is out of your comfort zone and sort of extract from that what it is that you can grow by learning that piece, how it is that you can grow by learning that piece that you might start in a place where you feel maybe on shakier ground, if that makes sense. So
about the vibrato, because, you know, of course, this is you know, we can get into this a little bit later.
Sure.
But you know, I want to come back to the idea of, you know, the intention of vibrato in a bit. So before we go there, let's talk about your time with at Iowa.
Oh, sure.
A little bit. Same question, like, you know, I had the same thing, you know, when I went to Northwestern to study with Henke. I thought I was going to go there and get my master's, and I'll probably go elsewhere for my doctorate, just because I wanted the 3 different perspectives, you know, teacher. And I found the same thing, like, while I was there at that time, Northwestern had a 1-year master's that you could do. You could do an accelerated.
Oh, sure.
For master's. And I did that, and I realized, like, okay, well, I need 1 year is not
right.
enough. So I opted to stay. So, you know, I'm very interested in what you have to say about your time with Dr. Che.
Sure. You know, man, the first time I met Dr. Che was actually at Ball State. He was the guest artist for Sax Timberfest, which is a festival. I'll just plug Sax Timberfest, a festival we still do every year here. That's really wonderful. We just had you here this year. And that's why I've really been so passionate about keeping that going, because there were, you know, 4 years of my life, we had 4 artists that just changed my life completely, you know. And I want to give that to my students as well. So anyway, I met Dr. Che, I think it was my junior year here. And I mean, in 30 minutes, he changed my playing forever, you know. And it wasn't because it was one of those light bulb moments for me where he talked about tongue position in a way that just at that moment in my life, at that time, it just clicked, you know. And I remember that night, it was one of those things where it clicked in a way that even after the master class was over and we went out to dinner and hung out and everything, first thing I did was go back to the practice room.
Yeah.
And it was like I just had a whole new lease on how to play the instrument, and I didn't want to put it down, you know, because it felt easier to play.
Right.
And basically at that point, all he was kind of trying to tell me was, I think the back of your tongue is too low. You need to raise it. And he gave me some sort of like syllabic concepts that are speech related to kind of get the tongue into that position, and in a very like entry level way, you know, not anything like how deep we got into it when I studied with him at Iowa, but it was so instantaneous for me that I thought, wow, there's definitely something going on out there that I need to investigate, you know? So it wasn't like when I left Ball State, I was dead set on studying with Dr. Che. I certainly had other places I was interested in. And then, you know, looking back, and I don't mean this to disparage any of the other people that I was interested in studying with, but it was one of those situations where it turned out to be the best thing that could have ever happened to me, because when I went to study with Dr. Che, it just became very clear to me that what he's giving me is exactly what I need, you know, and his was, the biggest things I took from him were, you know, just again, kind of in a more advanced way, the things I was talking about with Mr. Jones from earlier was, here's fundamentally how you manipulate this instrument to do what it is that you need it to do. And if you refine these techniques, if you want to call them, then you can really, the sky's the limit. You know, you don't really, you're not going to have any limitations. And that was, you know, I still, to this day, when I practice, I just have the ghost of Dr. Che like hovering over me saying, like, you know, don't do that. Or if I get into a bad habit or things like that, key popping or slap tonguing on when I'm not supposed to, or things like that, you know, that was the thing that I got from him, was that, you know, just because it's easier to do it doesn't mean that it's the best way to do it, you know? So he would always say, you know, I want you to do it the way that sounds best, mm-hmm. and not the way that is easiest, you know? And that's not to say that we don't all use shortcuts, you know, at different times. Sometimes it makes more sense to, you know? But it was just the idea that he would always say, if you're going to do something, make sure that you're doing it because you chose to do it, not because it's the only way that you can do it, right? So when we're talking about Altissimo or low notes or anything when it comes to doing a specific thing on the instrument, he would say, you know, you want to have the option that, okay, I'm choosing to do this at this moment because it makes sense, and it's not because I can't do it this other way, right? I can't start that note without popping the key or anything like that, you know? And so really just taking those principles and just applying it across the board was just huge for me, because it really shaped how I practiced. It really shaped how I sort of approached developing the various, you know, techniques that are associated with playing at a certain level. You know?
Uh-huh. So, yeah. I mean, and another way of putting it is just like not letting yourself get away.
Yeah. Oh no. And it was very, I mean, I tell this story all the time to my students, and I don't mind telling it because I think we both laugh about it now. I mean, there was a time, I remember studying the De Crook Sonata with Dr. Che. It was really late in my degree. I think it was probably 2012 or something like that. And he just wanted me to play the Altissimo stuff, not because he thought this is the way it should be played, but he wanted me to work on it both ways, just as an exercise in playing melodies in the Altissimo register and stuff like that. So, you know, we got to a certain point where my recital program was feeling really good and I was pretty ready to go and everything. And I'd been working on the program for quite a while. And there came a point where we worked on Altissimo A flat for 5 weeks in a row. I mean, there was 5 lessons in a row where I went in, and maybe there were a few other things we talked about, but it was like, that was what we were talking about.
First movement?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was like it was just, that was what we talked about for 5 hours, probably more than that, was why I was not getting the results that I needed as consistently as I needed to get them, and what I could do to make it better, what I could do to make it more consistent, what I could do to improve the vibrato, and it was like, man, I loved that stuff, how deep into it he would get. And so that's, when you said, don't let yourself get away with anything, the point I wanted to make was because I knew he wasn't going to let me get away with anything.
And so, I mean, let's dig into that A flat a little bit more.
Sure.
We've already spent 5 hours on it, I guess.
I dream about it,
But so, note fronts, overall tone quality, obviously, ring or resonance choices.
Yeah.
So like, I mean, 5 hours is a lot of time to spend on a note, right? But
Yeah.
what exactly was it that he was hearing that he wasn't liking, and where was the struggle with you?
Well, obviously in the first hour or two of the 5-lesson series, and I want to stress that I was I was almost done with my degree at this point. So, we had the time.
Right.
In the beginning, it was the obvious stuff. It was, okay, you cracked the note. This is why. This is how you can do that better. Mm-hmm. And then it was, okay, you're not in tune. This is why, what you need to make it better.
Right.
And it wasn't even that I didn't know what to do to make it better. It was just he was really holding my feet to the fire in the moment right there to say, like, okay, let's mess around with it and let's figure out what you need to do to make it right, number one. And number two, to make it so that 9.9 times out of 10, that's what you get.
Right.
And then it became, is there any junk in the sound? Is there a hiss happening in the sound? And then it became, is it resonant? And then it became, is it, what fingerings are we using? What are the different modes you can use to get to that result? And then making the artistic choice and all that. So I mean, it just, like I said, we start with the obvious, the usual suspects of why it wasn't going very well. And then we sort of graduated into, okay, now let's talk about what's our goal for the performance, and that's what I said with Dr. Che. There were so many little things like that I would just sort of take these ideas that he gave me and extrapolate them across the board with my whole approach to playing the instrument. And it just took my playing to a whole different place, as far as refinement and all that. I remember one sort of memory that sticks out to me is my senior recital at Ball State. I had a really good friend, a trombonist, who came to my recital and he listened, and I played a duo on my recital with another saxophone. Mm-hmm. And it was Stephen Page. Stephen and I, one of the composition faculty here at Ball State wrote us a duet. And so we played it and premiered it at the recital. And I remember my trombone friend, he was saying, it just sounds like, speaking about me specifically, he said, you guys both sound great. He said, but you need to get your refinement up, like it sounds heavy, like it just sounds like you're really working to make it happen.
Sure.
And so that was what I spent the next, I'm still spending the next forever of my life is that, is to try and make it sound like an extension of me rather than an attachment to me,
And this is something that Professor Rickmeyer would say all the time. As I think, she wouldn't say it in this way, but that great teachers don't just show you how to play something, they teach you how to teach yourself.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's absolutely what Che was doing with you. And
absolutely.
And just like, because sometimes I find that, either getting feedback from somebody that I admire, or me giving feedback to some of my students, like, if you're not aware of what you're hearing, you can't fix it, right? So
right.
The qualities of what you're hearing, and this goes towards the tone concept discussion too, is like, you need to be able to hear it before you can fix it.
Yeah.
And so when you're talking about fronts and then resonance and then all those other things, he's addressing each one of those concepts.
Yeah. And he would say that explicitly. He would just say, look, I mean, the whole point here is so that when you leave this place, you can still continue to get better.
Right.
And I try to tell my students that when they get frustrated with me about, well, I don't, all we do is this or all we do is that. And it's like, yeah, because that, figuring out how to do that, mm-hmm. you take those concepts that we use in figuring out that thing, and then you just apply that to kind of everything. And you understand the process of what it takes to get from point A to W, and once you get the process and you understand that, you can really do anything you want. We've talked about this separately. It's just, I don't really hear things that people do that make me say to myself, oh, there's no way I could ever do that.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say that I could just pick up my horn here and do anything at any time, but I mean, through studying with someone like Dr. Che, it just made me realize, like, okay, there's really, it's a process, you know. And that was going to be the other thing I was going to say that I took away from him was preparation, you know, and just how to prepare and the level of detail that is required when you prepare. And not that we didn't talk about that stuff with Dr. Wolf, but, you know, part of it was just given the fact that I was doing a lot of competitions and stuff when I was in grad school. Mm-hmm. And I remember Dr. Che saying very specifically, he would say, look, I'm never going to push you to do a competition, but if we're going to do it, then it's on.
Right.
And he said, I'm going to be there every step of the way, and I'm not going to hold back.
Yeah.
And me being the person that I am, I was like, all right, cool, let's do it, you know. And he wasn't kidding. I mean, I remember being in Belgium at Dinan, and I had an email from him within 20 minutes of my performance.
Oh, he was reading it.
Yeah.
Wow.
Watching it and critiquing it and saying, like, okay, if you do advance to the next round, you need to do this, this, and this, and this. You need to make sure you do this, this, and this different. I mean, he was very involved like that, you know, which was, that was great, you know.
Sure.
To have a teacher like that. But, you know, going back to the preparation thing, it was a level of detail thing. You know, he would always talk about, you know, obviously your performance is not going to be perfect because there's, you know, you're going to be nervous and there's anxiety and there's the human element. It's not going to be perfect. Mm-hmm. But he would say you have to prepare it in such a way that it's easier for you to play it correctly than it is for you to play it incorrectly. You know, when you get on stage, it has to be so much a part of you that playing it correctly is what feels natural to you.
Right.
You know, that even if it's the hardest thing that you have to play in the piece, that, you know what you're doing at that, you know what you're doing at that point to where you don't have any anxiety about it, or you have as little anxiety. Obviously there's anxiety, but you have as little anxiety as possible about it. So, you know, without sort of weighing too much on the word perfection, you know, he would say you have to prepare it so that it's perfect.
Right.
And understand that it's not going to be perfect, but your preparation has to be such that it is perfect, you know. And then it's kind of like that old cliche, you know, if you shoot for the stars or shoot for the moon, and even if you miss, you land among the stars kind of thing, you know.
Yeah.
Prepare it to that level of detail, even when you add in the few mistakes that are bound to happen just as a human being, you're still going to end up with something really special, you know. And that really that changed my life, just as far as, because, man, I'm telling you, he, like I said, what we talked about earlier, he wouldn't let you off, you know. I mean, that was always the joke, was that when you left your lesson with Dr. Che, the first place you went was the bar to forget about it, you know. And then you get back into the practice room, you know. But that was the joke, you know, is that you just left feeling, you know, an inch tall.
Yeah. Because
you work, you know, 4 or 5 hours a day on all this stuff, and you come in and again, I want to be very clear about this, in a very healthy and encouraging way.
Yeah.
Just get ripped to shreds, you know, and that sounds worse than it is, but, you know, pedagogically and fundamentally, you just get ripped to shreds, and it's like, okay, well, yeah, I mean, you sound good, but
right,
we got to do this, 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 and this. And so you just ended up with this whole new laundry list of like, oh, I got to go back and do that, you know? So it's like but through that, you know, you find this graduation, you know, it's like, okay, this week I was here. And even though maybe your morale never seems to kind of reach a certain point, when you look back on it, where you started and where you end up, you're like, oh, wow, you know, that whole time I was making huge improvement. And so that was always something that I laugh about it now. And I think we all go through that. It's the personal pressure we put on ourselves and everything. I don't want to misrepresent like he was not a positive teacher, because he very much was. But, you know, when you start talking about preparing to that level of detail, there's a lot of pressure that comes along with that, you know.
Sure.
And so I think it's important to, you know, one thing I always try to remind my students about is think about where you started, you know.
Yeah.
Number one, that, and number two, you know, I can't remember where I heard this expression, but the idea, like, don't compare your chapter 3 to somebody else's chapter 15.
Sure.
Because you're never going to win that battle with yourself.
Well, and so like, I guess along those lines, perspective is a hard thing to come by, especially when you're young.
Yeah.
And you're in the practice room every day hearing yourself, and you don't necessarily notice the incremental changes as much because you're in it every day. But over the course of a year, I always, talk to my students and I say, like, look, go back and listen to your recordings from your lessons at the beginning of the year, and now let's know what you're doing, and you can hear.
It's terrifying.
Yeah. So,
but really rewarding in a way,
Of course. So along those lines, who are some musicians or artists that you really find inspiring, either just like through, in any way, like what are some of your most inspirational?
Are we talking saxophonists or just musicians in general?
Musicians or even artists. It doesn't have.
Oh, sure. Man, that's, wow. Just another loaded question that, I'll stick to kind of the high points for me, or the sort of people who really start jumping out. Starting with saxophone, my earliest kind of saxophone hero was Eugene Rousseau, and that was just because he was the first. His Deutsche Grammophon album was the first saxophone album I ever owned. And so that was what I knew. That was classical saxophone to me.
Concerto's album?
Yeah. And then, I got into, when you read about him and you read, his teacher was Marcel Mule, well, then I got some Marcel Mule stuff. And then after that, it was, you start looking at, okay, well, who are some of the other people associated with Eugene Rousseau? And then quickly you end up into the Kenneth Cheys and the George Wolfs and the people like that. So my early kind of saxophone inspiration was definitely from that lineage of like Marcel Mule and Eugene Rousseau.
Yeah.
And then probably around the time I was in midway through high school, I got exposed to some of the Claude DeLong recordings. And so that was, I got into the DeLongs and the Formeaux, and some of that really, and the Londecs and stuff like that. I got into that realm. Mm-hmm. So that, I really, and Arno was another big one for me, like early college. I loved his recordings, like especially his Schmidt recording. And I remember sitting and comparing his Schmidt recording with Jim Umbel's Schmidt recording with, all the different Schmidt, with DeLong's recording and all that, so those would be some of the people I would say jump out at me big time. Dr. Che was definitely one for me. He was somebody that, even before I met him, something about his sound to me was just really alluring. And I just really thought, you always want to think that I want to sound like me. I don't want to just copy anybody else's style. But I think we all in the back of our mind go, if I had to just take someone else's sound, whose would it be? And for me, that's him. It's like in jazz, it's Cannonball. If I had to sound like somebody, if that was my goal, it would be him. If my goal was to sound exactly like another person, it would be Kenneth Che. I say that very openly because his sound continues to inspire me. Other musicians that I really dig, that really inspire me. If we're talking about classical music, a big one for me is Pavarotti. Mm-hmm. I listen to a ton of opera music. And Pavarotti, I feel like his virtuosity is just kind of beyond reproach.
Sure.
His command of his instrument was just so exquisite that there's so much you can learn just from listening to him, the way he phrases and the way he uses rhythm and the way he uses diction and the way he uses vibrato and his range and the fluidity of his range and all of his registers is just remarkable. Itzhak Perlman's another person I listen to quite a bit. I really love his stuff. Just again, kind of the same thing I was saying about Pavarotti. All of the components of his musicianship really speak to me as an individual. Rostropovich is another person I listen to quite a bit. There's this cellist that I ran into when I was working on my dissertation. I wrote my dissertation about the Debussy cello sonata, and there was this really great recording of Maurice Gendron, who was a French cellist. Mm-hmm. And I got into his stuff, and just a really remarkable, really different kind of player, but really great. And so like the Tortelier and the Maurice Gendron in the French cello school, a couple of those guys who were really big, are really big inspirations for me. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, I have to say that a lot of the inspiration that goes in to my saxophone playing is from music that I listen to that has nothing to do with saxophone at all. And just has to do with the effect that music has on me, just the personal kind of experience that I have with music. And I feel like I kind of channel that into whatever it is that I'm playing at any given moment. So my kind of, what do I listen to for pleasure outside of the world of classical music that's most directly applicable to concert saxophone is R&B. I listen to a ton of R&B music. I love R&B music, sing-alongs with the Coalescent Quartet, Boys to Men, and all that. You know, I just that's a style of music that really speaks to me, and I love listening to it. So that's my pleasure music, I call it. But yeah, those are some artists that I really love that just continue to. I listen to everything that I can find of them, and they just continue to inspire me.
Sure. So, you know, I said earlier, I wanted to talk a little bit about vibrato. Yeah. Back to that. You mentioned vocalists. I know a lot of us have talked about vocalists and vibrato and drawing inspiration from that. So you mentioned at first, Dr. Wolf would talk about the intention with vibrato.
Sure.
And so if you could kind of go back and just talk a little bit about that, like what your thoughts are on how to do it, how we can most do it in a way that sounds most natural versus kind of, you mentioned the on and off switch. Like, so what are your thoughts on that?
So it's interesting. I was thinking about it as I was saying it earlier, and I thought, I should have said that earlier. But when you asked about the correlations between food and cooking and saxophone playing, this is an analogy I use all the time, which is just, I compare vibrato to seasoning, how you season food, right? So what I always say is that, you know, if your sound, first of all, you have to have your sound has to be in the right spot, right? I mean, you got to have good pitch and a good centered focused sound. So that's what I compare to, like, a piece of meat, right? First, you got to learn how to cook a piece of meat, because even if if you cook a steak with nothing on it, even if you cook it perfectly, it's still pretty good to eat, right? So if you listen to straight tone saxophone, it was something that was just purely straight tone, but it was really beautiful straight tone, it would still be pretty good, right? So I always say, the seasoning is what kind of gives us, it takes it to that different place. It's what makes it's what creates that idea of balance on the plate, and just like seasoning, you can have too much or not enough. If you take a piece of meat and you just cover it in salt, it's inedible. So I mean, if you think about vibrato, if you just slap vibrato on everything, it's like putting ketchup all over everything. It's a way that so I feel like that's a sort of entry level kind of analogy that I can use for students to say, like, okay, too much, there can be too much and there can be not enough, but also this idea of seasoning is, there's a million different combinations of seasoning that you can think of that you can use in order to create different flavor profiles. And I like to think of vibrato in that way. It's like, what is it, the intention of vibrato? When I say that, what I mean is, what's the purpose of adding or taking away the vibrato at any given moment? Yeah. Am I trying to vocalize something? Am I trying to intensify something? Am I trying to pacify something? It just really, so I always try to think of it, anytime I'm using vibrato, thinking of it like, okay, what kind of vibrato am I trying to use here? What speed? And really, what is the purpose? You know, I always want to be very deliberate about how I use things, and vibrato most especially, because I feel like it can really draw people into your playing in a really fascinating way to me. But it can also really turn people off of your playing really quickly. I mean, I think we've all heard people on all different instruments who we thought, you know, I really like, I mean, they're obviously an amazing musician, but I can't handle the vibrato, you know? It's like when you play Marcel Mule for your students the first time that have never heard him, you know, you think, I mean, I think about it all the time with him, especially, and you play the recordings of him, of him playing like Caprice en forme de valse, and when you listen to it just from a technical standpoint, it's incredible. Even now with our standards of technique, like it's just phenomenal, the virtuosity, the technical virtuosity that he had. But then you listen to it and people chuckle, you know, at the vibrato, which we know is a difference in style and difference in era and everything like that. But it's just a way that just making the point that just the vibrato of Marcel Mule, I think for a lot of students early on, before they understand the significance of Marcel Mule, it immediately turns them off of him to where they go, yeah, I could listen to that. I understand he was important, blah, 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 but I'm going to go listen to this other guy with the more updated thing, you know? So vibrato can have this really profound effect on our perception of someone's playing. And so that's why I do focus on the intention, if you will, to use that term again, of my vibrato, definitely.
Yeah. Great. So then, all right, now what about Altissimo? So like, you know, interestingly, you know, you studied very much, as you kind of talked about, in the Rousseau lineage of playing and teaching. So what did that mean for your Altissimo study, how you learned it, and how you teach it now?
Sure. Man, it's a good question. I think that, you know, I was definitely one of the people who, you know, I could play some Altissimo when I was in high school. And it certainly wasn't great, and it certainly was not refined, and I didn't really know a lot about what I was doing, but I was able to produce some notes in that register, you know. So I started out, I guess, a little further along than some high school students did at that time, because now there's so many high school students who are playing Altissimo like crazy, and that's, I mean, I'm always thrilled to hear that, you know. As far as how I came about it and how I teach it, you know, I definitely didn't get into the kind of the inner workings of all of that until I was in college. And you know, I worked with Dr. Wolf, and he had a fingering chart that he had written that we would use. And I certainly worked out of the Rousseau book. And then when I got into grad school, it became sort of more deep diving into the Rousseau book and the kind of into the modes of the Altissimo, what he refers to as the modes. I always have to remember that Cinta refers, in his book, refers to modes as the modes of the overtones, and Rousseau refers to the modes as the modes of fingerings, you know. So I'm speaking about the modes of fingerings we got into with Dr. Che, and he just opened me up to a whole new, and again, I don't want to make it seem like that's disparaging Dr. Wolf at all. It was really out of necessity for the music that I was playing. You know, I was further along, so I was playing harder music kind of thing. Yeah. So we got into a whole new library of fingerings that I just had I didn't have any awareness of, you know, when I was in undergrad. And that was when we got into Lacour, and through Lacour starting to work on Samin, and, you know, getting opened up to the Samin systems and all that kind of stuff. So that was sort of my lineage pedagogically, I guess I would say. It was pretty straightforward, you know. I mean, it was, here's these different systems of fingerings, and here are these exercises you can do to become more fluid with those systems of fingerings. With regard to kind of my process, how I got there as far as just producing and controlling the registers, was very much the biggest strides I made, I felt like, were in grad school with Dr. Che, and that was because he really would go really deep into this idea of tongue position, which we could go on and on about the different nomenclatures people use for tongue position or voicing or however you want to refer to it. But basically just the overall principle of the control of what's going on inside of your mouth to manipulate the harmonics, And so I got really kind of hammered on that week by week, And one thing I think that was really big for me in that process was it wasn't just in the context of Altissimo, it was in the context of just the different, I refer to them with my students as kind of, there are these sort of pockets of tongue position, it's like there's a general place you need to be in for this kind of group of notes in this register. And then you kind of, it changes as you go up or down the horn, and it was like, and then obviously the higher into the instrument you get, the more sort of tiny they're like micro adjustments you need for notes that aren't necessarily very, I think of it, like we talk about with horn being such a difficult instrument to play because the partials are so close together versus an instrument like trumpet, right? So I kind of think of it like that in the Altissimo registers, like the higher up there you get, the more tiny these little adjustments are that you have to make to get the desired results. So it was really, I guess, to come full circle, it was really in grad school with Dr. Che that I got into sort of all of the different syllabic concepts and speech concepts and tongue shape concepts and things like that to really kind of to sort of refine my control of the Altissimo register.
Did y'all relate that to exercises on the horn?
Yeah, sure. Well, I did a lot of the overtone exercises from the time, I just thought they were cool, when I was in high school, and I just thought, oh, you can do, here's a fun little thing you can do. Yeah. And then it wasn't until, again, later on and getting into the Rousseau book pretty heavily that it was like, oh, okay, well, here's the sort of application of those things. So just working on the idea of, working on the concepts of like, this is how we move our tongue in order to create, a jump in register or a jump in partial, that kind of thing. That was certainly just starting with, low B flat, low B, low C, C sharp, the fundamental fingerings and going from there.
Sure.
Was definitely something that I worked on in the beginning. The other thing that I tried to spend a lot of time with early on was this idea of and this is something that Rousseau talks about in his book, is like, what are the fundamental fingerings? What are the fundamental fingerings for the Altissimo notes without all of the kind of added stuff that we have added throughout the course of time, right?
Yeah.
So like for G, like what do you consider to be the fundamental fingering for G? Just the fundamental key that you would hold down. Yeah, I'm asking. We're on the same page.
Well, B.
Yeah, exactly, right? So like, obviously knowing that if I hold down B and try to play a G, it's not going to be as good of a G just naturally as if I play the scrunch fingering or the front fingering or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But if I can create a really passable G on that fundamental fingering,
yeah, then
man, I own that note. You know what I mean?
I should say
the different fingerings is really not as hard.
Because they're closing. Like my favorite G fingering is I would say it's a B flat, not a B, because like you're closing,
sure,
right? So, but yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. I'm just talking about like, acoustically, like,
right,
where we are on the horn and and blowing the part. So blowing the sixth, right? So that's one thing I definitely did a lot of was, okay, I'm going to hold down C and try to play the best possible A that I can create.
Right.
And then from there, exploring all of the different, options that we have in the Nettie Weiss book, and then the Lundex Hello Mr. Sax book, and then the Rousseau book, and the Cinta book, and all these, and the Rosemary Lang and the Rasher books, and going, okay, what I want to, as many fingerings as I can get my hands on. And I always found that if I backtracked a little bit and went back to that fundamental, that if I really had command over that fundamental to get, again, some of them are more passable than others, as we all know. But if I could get something that was even in the ballpark of sounding good and in tune, that when I started to add all of these things that we've figured out over time, like, oh, this makes it a stronger, more resonant fingering, all that, then it was just that much easier for me to produce those notes with control, you know. So
you're working on overtones, but not necessarily from the traditional off of like a here's my low B flat.
Right, absolutely. I'm just starting a little higher in the process, right? Like it's the same idea. It's just kind of starting a few steps later, you know.
Yeah, that's a great hybrid approach, actually, almost like directly between Rousseau and Cinta. And
yeah,
and I think, and that's the thing about this, right? Is like both books are such like foundational texts for our field, and that's why I require my students to have both.
Yeah, me too.
So that, you know, like they can borrow from this and borrow from that. And
well, I think they both are assets, like just stand alone, you know, but I think that they both have things that the other one doesn't have, you know. I mean, obviously the Rousseau book is a more sort of comprehensive, for when it was written, a more comprehensive sort of overview of fingerings and modes.
Yeah.
But it doesn't start from the same playing field as the Cinta book does, which is kind of one of the beautiful things about the Cinta book, is that it starts with this assumption that you don't know anything about how to play Altissimo.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the beauty of that book, is that it really, in a very accessible way. I mean, I love the prose of that book, you know, where he talks about, you know, go into a dark corner, you know, turn off all the lights and clear out all the distractions. And I tell my students that all the time, even if you don't actually physically do that, that idea of, you know, this is how isolated you have to get with some of these things when you're trying to really sort of get over the hump. And I love that about that book. And the other thing I really love about that book is where he talks about the time that it takes.
Yeah.
So he's like, look, this one mode, and now speaking about the modes of the overtones,
right.
He's saying, you know, just to get the next mode, it might take you 2 weeks. It might take you 3 weeks.
Right.
This is something that we don't naturally walk around do. You know, we don't naturally walk around and move our tongue around in these kind of ways on purpose. You know, we just don't do that. We don't have any reason to. So I love that part about it, you know, that there's a humanistic element to that book that is just so refreshing to me, where it's like, look, I mean, this is not a really, this isn't a, you know, you do it for 3 days and you're going to get it kind of thing. I mean, it takes a lot of commitment. And that was reiterated when I watched that interview that he did with Paul Parr and Tim McAllister, when they did that interview, and he was talking about, you know, I told my wife I played my F major arpeggio up to Altissimo F today. You know, now I just got to make it sound good. And it's like, so here's somebody who wrote a book on playing Altissimo, and an important book at that, not just like a book. I mean, he wrote one of the books. And it's like, you know, he's saying I'm playing Altissimo, and I'm sure he's played Altissimo F for some time, but it's like, even he's looking at it like this is a long-term kind of thing that, you know, it takes a lot of dedication and commitment to, in order for it to really sort of come together in a way that's really useful to you. So yeah. I love that part about that book as well.
Absolutely.
The other stuff, yeah.
So for those of us watching, if you have a question, I've got one more question for Dr. Bogert, but if you have any questions for him, feel free to type it in the chat.
I want all the questions.
But I wanted to ask you about, like, what music are you into today? Like, what are you working on? What's keeping you, you know, when the schedule's been cleared, when plans and gigs and projects and everything have been wiped off the table, like, what are you looking forward to doing? What are you listening to? What are you studying?
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking me that, first of all. I guess one thing that I'm really looking forward to is that I guess this hasn't really changed for me since I left school. But one thing I do is, first of all, in every program I play, I always try to do something I've never done. Mm-hmm. You know, that's one thing that's very important to me, is that I always play some piece that I've never done. And really, I try to make it at least 2 pieces I've never done. Because I add a caveat to that, which is I want to do a piece that's a standard that I've never done. and I want to do something else that I've never done. And sometimes for programming reasons, it makes sense that the standard that I've never done sort of ends up satisfying all those requirements, because maybe I'm working on a program for a specific thing that requires me to do something I've done before. But there's so much great music out there that usually I'm able to do a couple pieces that I've never played before.
Right. Yeah.
And then I always try to throw some stuff in there that I think would be good for my students to hear me play. And then beyond that, I guess the overarching factor of everything that I'm into is that I made a commitment to myself way back when, and for a very personal reason, that I'm not going to play music I don't want to play. I just don't do it. I don't want to. It's not to say that there aren't a lot of amazing pieces out there that I would benefit from playing, but what I guess what I would say to give myself a little wiggle room out of that controversial idea is that I'm also open-minded enough to know that maybe a piece that I'm not really interested in playing right now, it doesn't mean that I'm not going to be interested in playing it forever,
Right.
And I come around like that with a lot of music. It's like, I remember being in grad school. When I started grad school, you couldn't convince me that I was ever going to play the Denisov Sonata. And then all it took was a few live performances, hearing people play it live, and I was like, I have to play the Denisov. So but I'm really passionate about that part of my own artistic output, is that I'm going to play music that really is important to me, that speaks to me at that moment. Some pieces that I'm just starting to, I just kind of finished up, obviously with everything the way it is, finished up some recitals that I was doing. And I'm really excited to start working on some new stuff. So I've got, 5 or 6 pieces on the stand right now. I'm doing that piece that you recorded, Range of Light, the Stephen Lies. I just got that actually in the mail today, so I'm super excited. But that one's been on my radar for a while.
I still really new music in the mail. I just love getting new music, new sheets.
I know.
It's like Christmas Day.
I know. It was a big thick envelope, and I was excited to get it. So I got that, and then the Biedenbender, the Image, Frenchify his title there. No, the Images, that's a piece I've been wanting to play. It was recommended to me by Bob Eason. He said, man, I think you would like this piece a lot. And I'd heard it, but I wasn't super intimately familiar with it. And then I started listening to it more and more and thought, man, yeah, this is definitely something I got to get and play. What else? Like I said, it's a little fuzzy right now because I just kind of put together some ideas. I've got the Debussy Rhapsody on my stand right now just because I heard Formeau play it in Bloomington early in the spring.
On the last trip, yeah.
And that was just like, he played a whole recital of just standards that was just incredible. He played Sankan and Debussy, and then he played a piece with Dr. Murphy. I can't remember the name of it. That was not a standard. It was a duo piece. But so I just thought, man, I need to get that back out because I love that piece. I'm working on, this is something that would be great to say. So I just recently did this consortium deal. I don't even know if I would call it a consortium because it's 5 people with Remy LeBoeuf. I don't know if you're not familiar with Remy's music, definitely get that way. Because his music is really beautiful. Mostly, I guess you would say Remy's a jazz saxophonist. I don't necessarily know what he prefers to be called, but he was one of the Copeland Fellows. I mean, he's an incredible player and composer. And he posted a while back, a video of him playing what he called a vignette. And I wrote him and said, man, this is really, I think you're onto something. And this is really cool. I really feel like we as a community could really benefit from having a book of pieces or etudes, whatever you want to call them, that was just saxophone. It's not Fairling, but it's also not Lenny Niehaus. It's saxophone, it's advanced. It could be played in a jazz style, it could be played in a classical style. It's just great music. And he said, man, I would love to be a part of that. I said, well, let me see if I can get some people together who are interested. And I was able to find 4 or 5 people, and we made it happen. And he actually just finished those, and they're incredible. Like, they're really cool. And there's 12 of them. So that's going to be known to the world before too long.
Yeah.
Like I said, it was kind of a small thing, so it wasn't like a big thing that we sent out and cast that net really wide, but the pieces are just really beautiful and very rimmy, and I think people are just going to love them. So, and the cool thing is they can be used as etudes. You can do them as they're kind of, I kind of like to think of them as the 2020 version of the Kirkland etudes. You know, you can use them in a lot of different ways. They're unaccompanied, but man, they have metric modulation, and the harmonic rhythm is really beautiful, and they use Altissimo, and they just use language from all kinds of stuff. They're just really, really cool, and I think people are really going to love those. Cool. So I've been he just sent me the copy the other day to look through, so we're perusing right now and making some edits and stuff like that, to add the Altissimo fingering suggestion, stuff like that. So I've been kind of tinkering with those, very entry level so far. And those are the things that jump out to me right now. I'm up for suggestions, though, if anybody's got some suggestions. I just, I want to, well, especially while we're all kind of cooped up, I want to, I'm trying to get through. I need to stay busy. So, yeah.
What are some of the newer, this is from Ohm.
Right. Hey, Ohm. Love you.
What are some of the newer things you've implemented in your pedagogical approach since you began collegiate teaching? Perhaps it's not something entirely new, but maybe there were approaches you refined.
Oh, wow. Well, one big thing for me that I have refined that I wasn't doing early on that I'm really big about now, I was just talking with my coalescent brothers about this yesterday, is fundamentals. Like how I go about doing that. Not that I wasn't always teaching fundamentals, but like holding their feet to the fire and putting together these sort of like goalposts. Okay, we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this. And that's what we're going to do. And because I feel like there's a lot to be taken from that, which is that, it gives the students in a good way. First of all, it holds them accountable. These are the assignments. You get to know right away, is this student really here? Are they really putting in the time?
Yeah.
Second of all, it gives them those kind of, it's much, when you're in the beginning stages of working on something, scales or intervals or whatever, it's very encouraging because you feel that progress much quicker than when you're working between 138 and 144, you feel it much more profoundly when you're between 50 and 60, right? So it's like giving them those things very concretely laid out in a very organized way, scale assignments and scales that they just need to know and all that kind of stuff. That's something that I just, I realized very early on that maybe none of my teachers did that with me individually because they knew I was doing that stuff on my own because I just had that kind of fire to go do it. Mm-hmm. But some of these kids are coming from different backgrounds where they don't know, they don't have the awareness of that, and that's not their fault. So it's like, that's something that I definitely have, now I have a 4-year plan of scale assignments, and obviously it's flexible to the students, their needs and their demands, but like, not their demands, but their abilities. But, just laying it out there really concretely for them. And I feel like, man, it has, I can say, we do juries here at Ball State. And it's like, since I started doing that, I have not had a single student fail a jury. Mm-hmm. First of all, to fail a jury, period. And second of all, I haven't had a single student not pass a scale test.
Yeah.
And I didn't have many before, but to go from some margin of error to 100% success rate was something that made me go, okay, this is definitely, it's working, it's, and yeah, they moan and groan about it at times, but I can't, and I'm sure you've gone through this, Dr. Nab, but like the amount of emails you get after the fact, once your kids are out there and they're working, and they go, man, I know I wasn't the greatest student, or I know we didn't see eye to eye on everything, but I just want to say thank you. Mm-hmm. For being hard on me and showing me that, just trying to prepare me for how much work this is all going to be when I get out there. You get those emails every year, because it's like, I tell my students all the time, I said, listen, what you're doing right now, this is so that you can be a better saxophone player. But really what I'm trying to do is just give you the tools so that you know what putting in a hard day's work is all about. So that, you know, when you're the band director at whatever school, the way that we practice, that's the way you're going to score study now.
Right.
That's the way you're going to write drill now. So it's like you instill these behaviors in your students that they can really carry over into anything, even if they decide to switch fields. You know, it's like they know how to put together a process to go from entry level to advanced, you know, and so I feel like kind of instituting a very concrete routine of fundamentals has been just really, really something really huge for me in my own personal teaching. So that would be something I would say that's new to me versus when I very first started out. And it was my fault because I just assumed, oh, well, like, you know, we all know that we have to practice our major scales, right? Like, that's what we do. But, well, no, we don't all know that. We all come from different backgrounds, you know? So, I mean, it was just one of those kind of oversights because I was in my own little world and it needed to change, and it did. And luckily I made it pretty quickly. And since then I've just, you know, continued to refine it. So
sure.
Yeah, that would be what I would say is the biggest thing for me.
What about, and here's another question, and this is a great one. So do you approach Altissimo differently when working within jazz or classical styles, either yourself or with your students?
No. As far as just the production of Altissimo notes and all of that, no. I mean, I think it's exactly the same process. Now, the positions and the whatever you want to call them, the tongue positions, the voicings used, yeah, of course, they're very different because timbrally I'm after something completely different, right? And the fingerings I find are often different because the mouthpieces kind of dictate that in a lot of ways, I find. I also play a different instrument when I'm playing jazz. If you know, so I mean, it's like I play a different Yamaha. I still play a Yamaha, but I play a different Yamaha, so that makes it a little different and a different neck. So that, you know, I find some of the fingerings on my classical setup are really strong, and then when I get to my jazz setup, they're not nearly as strong. But then something I don't typically default to in classical playing is stronger in jazz playing. You know, so as far as the approach to how to produce the notes, I find is exactly the same, and I use the same exact exercises. You know, and it's really funny because you see, like, if you just scroll through Instagram and watch all these really, you know, major figures in jazz, it's like, just look at the pedagogical materials they're using to play Altissimo. You're going to hear the same names that we're talking about right now. They're going to say, oh, the Rousseau book, or I hear Rosemary Lang a lot and Rasher a lot with jazz guys, because I feel like those books start with the overtone series and all that. So it's like, I don't know if that's just coincidence for me personally, but I have heard those two books being used a lot among jazz players. It's that whole like overtone series starting from the lowest fundamental fingering kind of deal. So yeah, but I mean, all goes to say there aren't, you know, I haven't really run into any of these jazz specific Altissimo pedagogical resources that are saying or doing anything differently than any of the texts that we've been talking about are. So I would say no in the execution, or sorry, no in the approach to how to produce the Altissimo register, but yes in the sort of very specific execution of the individual notes.
Yeah.
Yes. So
yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Well, great. That's our last question, sir. So,
did you have a last question?
I already asked mine.
Oh, I couldn't remember if you asked it or not.
But thank you so much for taking.
Oh, man, thank you. I hope that anybody got anything good out of it, and I'm really thankful for the opportunity to share kind of my story and stuff I'm working on, and I see some people on here who I really admire what you all do, and Kevin and Dan and John, congrats, John. You're going to do great down there in Memphis with Michael.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that's thank you again, and I look forward to watching the people who are left and going through the ones I haven't seen yet, and
Well, especially after the semester is already wrapped up. I know, we're heading into summer break, but this is such a great talking with you, and you gave us so much great insight. So, thank you, Nate, so much.
Yeah. Well, we'll do it again sometime.
All right, I hope so.
All right.
See ya.
See ya.